The morning my HOA tried to erase my garden was the same morning I decided to build something they'd never be able to control. I still remember the sound before I even opened my back door. Metal rattling, tires crunching over gravel. The low hydraulic whine of a landscaping trailer backing into my driveway at 7:13 on a humid Tuesday morning in late June. I had just poured coffee into my old thermos when the sprinkler system kicked on behind the house with its usual ticking rhythm, spraying cold water across the raised garden beds I'd spent 3 years building by hand. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers climbing cedar trellises I cut myself. The air smelled like wet dirt and fresh basil. For about 5 seconds, everything felt normal. Then I heard a woman's voice say, "That's far enough." I looked through the kitchen window and saw Diane Whitmore standing near my side gate in a cream-colored blazer like she was about to host a country club luncheon instead of destroy somebody's property before breakfast. Behind her sat a white HOA utility truck with the neighborhood logo stamped across the doors. 2 landscapers stood awkwardly beside it holding weed trimmers and hedge clippers like they already regretted showing up. Diane didn't even wait for me to step outside before she started talking. "Grant, we've issued multiple notices regarding unauthorized agricultural activity on HOA property standards." I stared at her through the screen door for a second because I honestly thought she was joking. Agricultural activity. She was talking about 6 tomato plants and a few raised beds. "It's a garden," I said. "No," she replied, folding her hands together calmly. "It's a violation." The sprinkler heads kept clicking beside her shoes while water mist drifted across the morning sunlight. One of the landscapers avoided eye contact with me completely. Diane pulled a yellow envelope from her leather folder and held it out like she was serving court papers. "Effective immediately, you are being fined $200 per day until the unauthorized structures and crops are removed." I took the envelope slowly. The paper already felt damp from the humidity. Across the top in bold capital letters were the words "Property Appearance Violation." Behind Diane, my neighbor Mason Pike stood frozen halfway down his driveway holding a garbage bag, pretending not to watch. Curtains shifted across the street. People were looking through windows. Diane knew exactly what she was doing. Public embarrassment worked better than rules ever could. "You can't seriously be fining me over vegetables," I said quietly. Diane smiled without warmth. "This neighborhood has standards, Grant. People didn't move here to live next to a farm." Then one of the landscapers stepped backward and accidentally crushed the corner of my cucumber bed under his boot. Soil collapsed against the cedar plank with a soft crack. I looked down at the wet dirt sliding into the grass, and something inside me went completely still. Not angry. Not yet. Just quiet. Because what Diane Whitmore didn't know was that 42 miles outside that perfect little subdivision, hidden behind an abandoned county road and a rusted gate nobody had opened in years, I already owned 50 acres of farmland with my family name still buried in the deed. By Thursday afternoon, the entire neighborhood knew me as the guy who got fined for growing vegetables. It spread faster than I expected. People in HOA communities always pretend they mind their own business until somebody becomes entertainment. Then suddenly, everybody notices everything. I could feel eyes following me every time I pulled into my driveway after work. Sprinklers hissed across perfectly trimmed lawns while garage doors cracked open just enough for people to watch without being obvious about it. Even the air felt different that week. Hotter, tighter, like the whole subdivision had decided I was now the problem they all shared together. When I walked to my mailbox that evening, another yellow envelope was already waiting for me. $200 more. Additional non-compliance fee. Diane had not wasted a single day. I stood there under the fading orange glow of the streetlights listening to cicadas scream from the trees while the paper shook lightly in my hand from the warm wind. Across the street, somebody laughed. Quiet but loud. Enough. I looked up and saw 3 neighbors standing in a driveway beside a silver golf cart. One of them nodded toward my backyard. "Careful," he said jokingly. "Grant is going to start charging us for fresh eggs next." They laughed again. I smiled politely because sometimes staying calm unsettles people more than yelling ever could. But that night, after the neighborhood finally went quiet and the porch lights blinked off one by one, I opened my garage and turned on the single fluorescent light hanging above my workbench. The smell hit me immediately. Old motor oil. Dust. Rusted steel. My father's red tractor sat beneath a canvas tarp exactly where I had left it after hauling it back from storage 6 months earlier. A 1978 International Harvester with faded paint and cracked leather seating. Most people would have seen junk. I saw history. I pulled the tarp back slowly and ran my hand across the hood, while crickets chirped outside through the open garage door. Then I grabbed the folded county map sitting on the workbench beside a stack of unpaid HOA notices. The map was stained at the corners from years of use. My father used to carry it in his truck before he lost the property during the recession almost 15 years ago. But 3 months earlier, after a long legal mess involving unpaid taxes and abandoned acreage, I quietly bought the land back under my own name. 50 acres outside town near Mercer Ridge Road. No HOA. No committees. No decorative mailbox regulations. Just open ground and an old irrigation well that had not run since the early 2000s. I spread the map across the hood of the tractor and stared at the property lines while the fluorescent light buzzed overhead. My phone vibrated suddenly. A neighborhood group chat notification lit up the screen. Somebody had posted a picture of my garden from over the fence. Underneath it, another resident commented, "Next thing you know, he will have goats out there." More laughing emojis followed. I locked the phone and slid it face down across the workbench. Then I looked back at the map, back at the faded red tractor, back at the old Mercer family property outlined in black ink. And for the first time all week, I smiled. Because while Diane Whitmore and the rest of the neighborhood were busy turning me into a joke, none of them realized I had already started planning something so much bigger than a backyard garden. Saturday morning arrived heavy with summer heat and low gray clouds hanging over the highway as I drove my old Ford pickup north out of town with the county map folded on the passenger seat beside me. The farther I got from the subdivision, the quieter everything became. No trimmed hedges. No matching mailboxes. No HOA patrol trucks crawling through streets at 12 miles per hour. Just open land, telephone poles, and dry grass rolling beneath the wind like waves. I passed the old gas station near Miller Creek, crossed a narrow steel bridge over shallow water, then turned onto Mercer Ridge Road, where the pavement finally gave up and became cracked gravel. Dust swirled behind the truck while country radio crackled softly through the speakers. I had not been out there since signing the final property papers 2 months earlier. Back then the land still felt like an idea, a memory, something too big to touch yet. But after Diane turned my backyard into a neighborhood spectacle, the place suddenly felt real. Necessary, even. The rusted gate appeared around the bend exactly where I remembered it, hanging crooked beneath a faded wooden sign barely readable under years of dirt and sun damage. Mercer Family Produce. My father painted those words himself before I was born. I parked beside the gate and stepped out into the heat. The smell hit immediately. Dry weeds, warm dirt, old cedar. Somewhere in the distance, cicadas buzzed so loud they almost sounded electrical. The chain around the gate snapped loose easily after years of rust, and the metal groaned across the gravel as I pulled it open. Beyond it stretched 50 acres of abandoned farmland that looked forgotten by time itself. Waist-high grass covered most of the property. Sections of old fencing leaned sideways into weeds. A collapsed equipment shed sat near the western edge beside an irrigation ditch packed with mud and cattails. But underneath all that neglect, I could still see what this place used to be. Rows, structure, possibility. I walked slowly toward the center of the field while my boots crushed dry grass beneath me. Wind pushed through the property, carrying the smell of soil baked under years of summer sun. Then I saw it. The old well pump near the north side of the land. Rusted, bent, half covered in vines. My father used to tell me that pump kept the farm alive through 2 drought seasons back in the 1990s. I brushed dirt from the faded metal housing and felt something strange settle into my chest. Not nostalgia exactly, more like unfinished business. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. Another HOA email notification. Another violation update. I did not even open it this time. Instead, I stood there in the middle of 50 empty acres listening to wind ripple through dead grass while clouds rolled slowly over the hills beyond the property line. Then I finally said the words out loud for the first time. If they do not want farming inside the neighborhood, I muttered quietly, staring across the land, I will build something outside it they can never stop. The moment the sentence left my mouth, the whole plan suddenly became clear. Not a garden, not a hobby, something bigger, something permanent. And back in that perfect little subdivision with its polished lawns and fake smiles, Diane Whitmore still thought she had already won. The next 2 weeks settled into a strange rhythm that felt almost peaceful on the surface if you ignored the tension underneath it. Every morning before sunrise, I drove 42 miles out to Mercer Ridge with a thermos of black coffee riding in the cup holder and dust already coating the sides of my truck before 6 o'clock. Then every evening I returned to the subdivision where perfectly watered lawns glowed green beneath neighborhood streetlights, while fresh HOA violation notices waited in my mailbox like clockwork. It became almost funny after a while. $200 for visible gardening equipment. $300 for non-compliant backyard appearance. Another warning for decreased visual harmony within the community. Diane kept inventing new phrases to describe dirt and vegetables like she was writing policy for a luxury resort instead of policing suburban flower beds. Meanwhile, I stopped arguing completely. That was the part that confused everybody. People expect conflict to make noise. They expect shouting, defending yourself. Instead, I started quietly removing things from my backyard one piece at a time. The raised beds disappeared first, then the trellises, then the garden hose reels near the fence. Every evening after work, I loaded tools into my truck while neighbors watched through blinds and half-open garages. By the second week, the backyard looked almost empty except for patches of overturned soil baking beneath the July heat. Diane noticed immediately. Of course she did. One afternoon, she slowed her white SUV beside my driveway while I was loading cedar planks into the truck bed. "I am glad to see you finally cooperating," she said through the passenger window with that same cold smile. I wiped sweat from my forehead and nodded politely. "Just cleaning things up," I replied. She glanced toward the stripped backyard and looked genuinely satisfied. "That is all we ever wanted." Then she drove away without realizing every single board in my truck was headed somewhere she could not touch. Out at Mercer Ridge, the real work had already begun. The old equipment shed came down first. Caleb drove out one Saturday morning to help me clear debris, and by noon the air smelled like cut wood, diesel fuel, and hot metal under the summer sun. We worked in silence most of the day except for the sound of chains rattling and the occasional rumble of the tractor engine coughing back to life after years of sitting dead beneath that tarp in my garage. Hearing that engine finally turn over again felt like waking up part of my childhood. Thick gray smoke rolled briefly from the exhaust before the motor settled into a deep, steady growl that echoed across the empty acreage. Dad would lose his mind if he saw this thing running again. Caleb laughed, leaning against the fence with grease smeared across his hands. I looked out across the property while dry wind bent the tall grass in slow waves beneath the sunlight. Survey flags now marked future irrigation lines. Fresh gravel had already been poured near the entrance road. And beside the north field, stacks of lumber waited under heavy tarps for the greenhouse foundation arriving next week. Little by little, the abandoned land was waking up again. But back inside the subdivision, Diane still thought she was winning. In fact, she became bolder because of it. 3 days later, I came home from work and found my backyard gate standing slightly open. At first, I thought maybe I forgot to latch it. Then I noticed the hose line beside the fence had been sliced clean in half, and one of the remaining irrigation timers ripped loose from the wall. Water dripped steadily into the dead grass, while evening cicadas buzzed from nearby trees. I stood there silently listening to the slow-ticking leak hit the dirt beneath my boots. Then I looked up and saw Diane Whitmore standing at the corner sidewalk talking casually with another board member while glancing toward my property like she wanted me to notice she had been there. By the middle of August, the subdivision looked exactly the way Diane Whitmore wanted it to look. Lawns trimmed to identical heights. Flower beds edged perfectly with fresh mulch. American flags hanging from matching front porches like props on a movie set. And right in the middle of all that polished perfection sat my nearly empty backyard with brown patches where the garden used to be. Every time Diane drove past my house, she slowed down just enough to admire the damage she thought she caused. Meanwhile, 42 miles away, Mercer Ridge was transforming into something alive again. The first greenhouse frame arrived on a flatbed truck just after sunrise one Friday morning, while fog still hung low across the fields. I stood near the gravel entrance holding paperwork against the wind as workers unloaded steel beams piece by piece onto the property. The sound of metal clanging echoed across the open acreage while diesel engines idled beside stacks of lumber and irrigation piping. The air smelled like wet dirt because a storm had rolled through overnight, leaving the soil dark and soft beneath our boots. For the first time in years, people were working that land again. Real work. Honest work. Not HOA meetings and complaint letters. By noon, the skeleton of the greenhouse stood against the horizon like something waking up from a long sleep. Caleb climbed down from the tractor, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. "You know," he said, looking out across the field, "if Dad could see this place now, he would probably cry." I looked toward the old fence line where tall grass bent beneath the wind and nodded slowly. "He never stopped believing this land mattered," I said quietly. Then my phone buzzed again. Another HOA email. Another violation notice. This time they were fining me because a trailer hitch remained visible in my driveway overnight. I almost laughed reading it. Thousands of dollars in greenhouse materials surrounded me while county-approved permits sat signed inside my truck, and Diane was still obsessing over driveway appearances. That was when I realized something important. She did not actually care about rules. She cared about control. Back in the neighborhood, things kept escalating in small ways that looked innocent enough unless you paid attention. Somebody reported my trash cans for being left out 30 minutes too long. Somebody else complained about dirt tracked onto the curb near my driveway after I unloaded tools. Then one evening I came home and found tiny orange survey flags pushed into the grass along my property line. The next morning, workers hired by the HOA began installing a decorative privacy fence directly beside my backyard. Diane stood there in oversized sunglasses, supervising the whole thing like she was overseeing a military operation instead of a fence installation. "Board-approved enhancement project," she explained when she noticed me watching from my driveway. Residents requested a visual barrier. Visual barrier. That was her phrase for hiding my property from the neighborhood. The workers kept digging post holes while the smell of fresh-cut lumber drifted through the humid afternoon air. I simply nodded and carried another load of equipment into my garage without arguing. That seemed to irritate Diane more than any fight could have. She wanted resistance. She wanted emotion. Instead, I gave her silence. 3 nights later, around 9:30, heavy rain rolled across the subdivision while thunder rattled windows throughout the neighborhood. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing irrigation layouts for Mercer Ridge when motion alerts suddenly lit up my phone from the security cameras facing my backyard gate. I opened the live feed and watched Diane Whitmore step onto my property, holding an umbrella while another HOA board member followed behind her carrying large yellow bolt cutters. Rain hammered the subdivision hard enough that night to blur the security camera footage every few seconds beneath streaks of water sliding across the lens, but the faces were still perfectly clear. Diane Whitmore stood under a black umbrella beside my backyard gate, while another HOA board member forced the bolt cutters through the chain latch with a loud metallic snap that echoed through the storm. I sat alone at my kitchen table watching the live feed glow across my phone screen while thunder rolled outside my windows. The timestamp in the corner read 9:42 p.m. Diane stepped through the gate first without hesitation like she owned the property. The other man followed carrying a flashlight that swept across the empty yard where my garden used to be. They walked slowly through the mud, stopping beside the remaining irrigation hookup near the fence. I turned the volume higher. Rain hissed through the microphone while Diane's voice pushed through the static. "He will probably move soon anyway," she said casually. "Nobody fights the board forever." The other man laughed quietly. Then he bent down near the irrigation timer and started pulling wires loose from the wall while Diane watched. I did not move. I did not call anybody. I just sat there in silence listening to rain pound against the roof while water dripped steadily from the broken line outside. Because the truth was, I had already stopped caring about the backyard. Diane still thought the fight was happening inside the subdivision. She had no idea the real battle had already moved 42 miles north. The next morning the storm passed, leaving the air cool and heavy with the smell of wet pavement and soaked pine needles. By 6 o'clock, I was already driving toward Mercer Ridge with the security footage saved in 3 different places on my phone. Morning fog rolled low across the county roads while sunlight slowly broke through the clouds in pale orange streaks. And when I finally turned through the old gate onto the property, I stopped the truck completely because for the first time since buying the land back, it no longer looked abandoned. Workers were already moving across the acreage, unloading irrigation pipe near the greenhouse frame. The restored tractor sat idling beside stacks of cedar planters, while fresh gravel crunched beneath pickup tires pulling into the property. The entire place smelled alive. Wet soil, fresh lumber, diesel fuel, growing things. Caleb waved from near the greenhouse structure while a local contractor named Roy Bennett reviewed measurements beside the future produce stand location. "You need to see this," Caleb shouted over the engine noise. He led me toward the north side of the property where the old irrigation well had finally been repaired overnight. Water blasted from the main line into the field with a deep rushing sound that echoed across the open land. Clean, cold groundwater sprayed into sunlight, while muddy channels filled for the first time in over a decade. I stood there listening to that water run through my family's land again, and something inside me settled completely. Back in the neighborhood, Diane was still cutting hoses and sending fines. Out here, I was building something permanent. By the following weekend, the first crop rows had already been planted beneath the greenhouse panels. Tomatoes, lettuce, sweet corn, pumpkins for the fall season. Every morning before work, I drove out to Mercer Ridge in darkness and left covered in dust after sunrise. Then every evening, I returned home to another pile of HOA notices taped to my front door. One afternoon, I found a new letter warning me about persistent community disruption. I laughed reading that one because at the exact same moment, a wooden sign was being raised beside Mercer Ridge Road with fresh white lettering carved across dark cedar boards. Mercer Ridge Farm. Established 1984. Restored 2026. And somewhere deep down, I think Diane Whitmore already felt the shift happening even if she could not explain why. The first Saturday Mercer Ridge Farm opened to the public. I woke up at 4:15 in the morning to the sound of rainwater dripping from the greenhouse roof and the distant rumble of diesel trucks arriving before sunrise. For a few seconds, I just stood outside the farmhouse shed holding a cup of coffee while cold morning air rolled across the fields carrying the smell of wet soil, cedar mulch, and sweet corn. Rows of string lights stretched above the produce stand glowing softly against the darkness, while workers unloaded crates of tomatoes, peaches, and pumpkins beneath portable floodlights. Everything around me felt alive. The greenhouse windows reflected pale blue dawn light. Gravel crunched beneath boots. Somewhere behind the barn, Caleb argued with a smoker grill that refused to light, while country music played low through an old radio balanced on a folding table. 6 weeks earlier, I had been standing in my subdivision holding HOA violation notices beside a destroyed backyard garden. Now there were over 30 cars parked along Mercer Ridge Road before sunrise, and more arriving every minute. By 8 o'clock the farm was packed. Families walked through the pumpkin rows carrying paper baskets filled with produce, while kids climbed hay bales near the entrance sign. Food trucks lined the gravel parking area, sending the smell of barbecue smoke and fried onions drifting across the property. Local photographers wandered through the sunflower patch taking pictures, while a couple from the county tourism board asked if they could feature the farm in their fall events brochure. I barely had time to answer questions because people kept stopping me every few feet wanting to talk about the land, the greenhouse, the restored tractor sitting near the produce stand. "You built all this in 2 months?" one man asked while staring across the fields in disbelief. I smiled and looked out toward the irrigation lines sparkling under the sunlight. "Not exactly," I replied quietly. "My family started it a long time ago." Around noon I noticed something that almost made me laugh out loud. Cars from my subdivision had started arriving one after another. I recognized the silver golf cart couple immediately. Then came 2 board members from the HOA pretending they were just passing through the county. Even Mason Pike showed up wearing sunglasses and carrying a lemonade while trying not to look awkward. Nobody mentioned the violation notices. Nobody joked about hillbillies anymore. Instead, they walked through the market buying tomatoes and homemade jam beside families from all over the county. The entire atmosphere had shifted, and everybody could feel it. Around 2 in the afternoon, Caleb walked over holding his phone with the strangest expression on his face. "You need to see this," he said. A local community page had posted drone footage of the farm taken earlier that morning. The video showed rows of crops stretching across the property while cars filled the parking area and kids ran through the pumpkin patch beneath bright fall decorations. But underneath the video, somebody had posted another clip. The security footage from my backyard during the rainstorm. Diane Whitmore standing inside my property while the other board member cut the gate chain beside her. The comments underneath were exploding so fast they refreshed every few seconds. People were furious, not because of vegetables, because of trespassing, abuse of authority, harassment. Suddenly, residents from the subdivision started sharing their own stories about fines, threats, and selective enforcement. By late afternoon, the county zoning office had already contacted me requesting copies of the footage. I stood near the produce stand watching sunlight settle across the fields while dozens of families filled the property around me laughing, eating, shopping, living. Then my phone rang. Diane Whitmore. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Her voice sounded tight and controlled in that dangerous way people sound when panic is starting to leak through professionalism. "Grant," she said carefully, "I think we may need to discuss some misunderstandings before this situation escalates further." I looked out across the farm while wind moved slowly through rows of corn beneath the setting sun. Then I glanced toward the old red tractor parked beside the entrance sign with my family name painted proudly across the wood behind it. "It already escalated," I said quietly. "You just did not notice when it stopped being about the neighborhood." 3 days after the farm opening, the HOA announced an emergency community hearing scheduled for Thursday night at the clubhouse near the subdivision entrance. The email subject line read Community Standards Review, but everybody already knew what it was really about. By then, the security footage had spread through half the county. Local pages reposted it. Residents argued about it online nonstop. Even people who had defended Diane for years suddenly stopped speaking too loudly whenever her name came up. The entire atmosphere inside the neighborhood changed almost overnight. Lawns still looked perfect. Sprinklers still clicked across the grass every morning. But now there was tension underneath everything, like static before a thunderstorm. Thursday evening arrived hot and windless. I drove back from Mercer Ridge wearing jeans still dusted with dry soil from the pumpkin field because I did not care enough to change clothes for people who spent months trying to humiliate me over tomatoes. As I pulled into the clubhouse parking lot just before 7 o'clock, I realized half the neighborhood was already there. Cars lined both sides of the street. People stood outside whispering beneath the yellow glow of parking lot lights while crickets screamed from nearby trees. Through the clubhouse windows, I could see folding chairs packed wall to wall with residents holding printed HOA documents and phones ready to record everything. Diane had probably imagined this meeting going very differently. Inside, the room smelled like burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while ceiling fans pushed warm air around the crowded space. Diane Whitmore sat at the front table beside 2 visibly nervous board members wearing a navy blazer and pearl necklace, like she was still trying to project authority through pure appearance alone. But the second I walked into the room carrying a small black folder, conversations immediately stopped. Every eye followed me. Diane's expression tightened for just half a second before she forced another professional smile onto her face. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "thank you for attending." I nodded once and sat near the front beside Ruth Delgado from the county zoning office and an attorney named Michael Reeves who specialized in agricultural land use disputes. Diane noticed them immediately. So did everybody else. The hearing started with 20 minutes of HOA language about maintaining community standards and protecting property values. Diane spoke calmly at first, but I could hear the strain underneath her voice now. Then she finally turned toward me. "Due to repeated noncompliance and ongoing disruption," she announced, "the board intends to pursue legal collection of all outstanding fines unless immediate resolution can be reached." The room went quiet. I opened the black folder slowly and slid several documents across the table toward Ruth Delgado. She adjusted her glasses and stood up in front of the room while papers rustled nervously through the crowd. "For clarification," Ruth said, "Mercer Ridge Farm is fully county-approved agricultural property operating outside HOA jurisdiction." Diane blinked once. "That is not relevant to neighborhood violations," she replied sharply. Ruth continued anyway. "Additionally, after reviewing submitted footage and resident complaints, the county has opened an inquiry regarding unauthorized property access conducted by members of this board." The room exploded into whispers. Diane's face drained of color so fast, it almost looked unreal beneath the fluorescent lights. Then Michael Reeves connected his laptop to the projector mounted above the wall. Rainy security footage filled the screen. Diane standing inside my backyard beside the broken gate while the other board member cut the chain. Timestamp visible. Audio clear. Nobody spoke during the clip. You could hear only the rain and the projector fan humming overhead. When the footage ended, silence sat over the room, like pressure before collapse. Finally, somebody from the back shouted, "You told us he was violating the neighborhood. You never said you were sneaking onto his property." Then another resident stood up. Then another. Complaints started pouring out from every direction about selective fines, intimidation, and board abuse going back years. Diane tried regaining control twice before finally realizing nobody was listening to her anymore. I stayed seated through the entire thing with dirt still clinging to my boots from the farm, while the authority she spent months weaponizing against me collapsed right there under cheap clubhouse lights. By October, Mercer Ridge Farm had become the kind of place people drove an hour just to visit on weekends. Every Saturday, the gravel parking lot filled before 9 in the morning with pickup trucks, family SUVs, and tour buses from nearby towns carrying people who wanted fresh produce, pumpkin patches, homemade pies, and pictures beside the old red tractor parked near the entrance sign. The same tractor that spent years buried beneath a tarp in my garage now sat polished beneath strings of warm lights, while kids climbed onto the tires for photographs and parents lined up beside the produce stand buying sweet corn and jars of local honey. The entire property smelled like cinnamon, wood smoke, and fresh hay. Wind rolled through the cornfields carrying the sound of laughter across the acreage, while live acoustic music drifted from the barn patio every weekend. Sometimes I would stand near the greenhouse just before sunset watching people spread across land everybody once forgot existed, and it still felt unreal how quickly everything changed. Back at the subdivision, things had changed too. Diane Whitmore officially resigned from the HOA board less than 2 weeks after the hearing. The county investigation expanded after multiple residents filed complaints about unauthorized fines and property access practices dating back years. One board member moved away entirely before Thanksgiving. Another stopped attending meetings after residents demanded financial transparency. The same neighborhood that once laughed at me for growing tomatoes now quietly recommended Mercer Ridge Farm to friends visiting from out of town. The funniest part was watching how carefully people tried to rewrite history afterward. Neighbors who barely spoke to me months earlier suddenly waved from their driveways. A few even apologized awkwardly while buying produce on weekends. Mason Pike showed up almost every Saturday morning carrying black coffee and pretending he always supported the farm from the beginning. I never argued with any of them. There was no point. The land had already answered for me. One cold evening near the end of October, I drove back through the subdivision after closing the farm for the night. Leaves scraped across the pavement beneath streetlights while porch decorations flickered with cheap orange Halloween lights. The neighborhood looked exactly the same on the surface. Perfect lawns, quiet sidewalks, decorative fences. But the illusion felt thinner now somehow, less powerful. As I turned the corner near Diane's old street, I noticed a new real estate sign planted in front of her house. For sale. The porch lights were off. No SUV in the driveway. No perfectly staged flower pots beside the walkway anymore. Just silence and fallen leaves collecting near the curb. I sat there for a second with the truck engine idling softly while cold air drifted through the cracked window, carrying the smell of distant chimney smoke. Then I drove away without stopping. Later that night, I returned to Mercer Ridge after everyone else had gone home. The fields stretched dark beneath a sky filled with sharp autumn stars while crickets hummed softly through the grass. I walked slowly past the greenhouse, past the produce stand, past rows of harvested pumpkins glowing pale beneath the moonlight until I reached the old tractor sitting near the entrance sign. The metal hood still carried faint scratches beneath the fresh paint from decades of work my father once poured into this land. I rested one hand against the warm steel while wind moved quietly across the fields around me. Months earlier, Diane Whitmore tried to make me feel small over a backyard garden because she believed authority meant deciding what other people were allowed to grow. But standing there in the middle of 50 living acres beneath the cold October sky, I finally understood something she never did. Real power is not forcing people into smaller lives. Real power is building something so honest and alive that no amount of control can stop it once it starts growing.